Buongiorno a tutti, io sono Grazia Baggi e faccio parte del gruppo di giovani volontari di Bergamo Scienza. Prima di iniziare vi chiedo un momento di attenzione e vi ricordo che, collegandosi al sito bergamoscienza.it e cliccando sul pulsante live, è possibile postare su Facebook e Twitter la diretta dell'evento e inviare domande ai relatori o invitare i propri amici e follower a seguire la conferenza in streaming. Le domande dal web vengono
Questions from the web we've received by us. We'll select them and give them during the Q&A. For the simultaneous interpreting, you have to scan the QR code. You can find it projected behind me. That will direct you to the Converso web app, where you will be able to select the language you need. So as to listen to the translation, you need your own headphones. Please use your own. Whoever should not have them can ask in the room. So welcome to today's event called Le piante, plants, intelligence or ununderstood. As speakers we have Paola Bonfante from the Università degli Studi di Torino and Paco Calvo from the University of Murcia in Spain. The conference will be moderated by Danilo Zagaria, biologo, biologist and scientific speaker. Please silence your phones and come in numbers. Thank you and enjoy.
Bene.
Very well.
Grazie di essere qui.
Thank you for being here
Di domenica mattina, insomma,
on Sunday morning. Seeing this many people in the audience is really cool. Possibly the theme really interests people, and whoever isn't tightly connected to the scientific world. Briefly, I shall introduce the two guests who will dialogue between each other today. Paola Bonfante from the University of Torino, professor of plant biology who's been pioneering the world of plant mycorrhizal fungi relations and their endobacteria. She belongs to many academics in Europe and overall, and she's been really cited throughout the world. In 2021, one of her popularizing books was published called One Plant is Not an Island, Discovering an Invisible World, and edited by Il Mulino. So welcome, Paola. Thank you for being here with us today. Next to her, we see Paco Calvo, the second guest, who will talk with Paola Bonfante on the topic, scientist, philosopher, who works at the Mint Lab for the Murcia University and uses time-lapse photography so as to explore the intelligent plant behavior. He's published many articles throughout the years. And in Italy, we have his book translated, Planta Sapiens, Why the Vegetable World is Similar to Us More Than We Think, published by Il Saggiatore. So before we give the floor to the two guests, just a brief introduction so as to better understand the topic of today. Starting from my own experience, I write about science on Il Corriere della Sera, and over the last years I have been asked to write or review books on plant intelligence or overall the plant world, because it is a topic that over the last years has become, let's say, fashionable as a scientific topic which is really in vogue. For many reasons, I do believe, and I highlighted that before, as there are many of you here today in the audience, but not only for this, also because in Italy we cannot ignore the fact that Stefano Mancuso is one of the most well-known scientists in the public, often appearing in TV and writing many books on this topic. He's a real reference point for this sort of topics. in Florence. He is head of the LINV, the International Laboratory of Neurobiology for Plants. Besides this, several books have been published over the past few years, written by scientists, philosophers, science popularizers, and journalists, which is only a sign of how interesting this topic is. Some of these are l'albero madre, or the mother plant, Susan Bizard, Flower Power by Alessandra Viola, So Spoke the Plant, Monica Gagliano. And I reckon that these books, popularizing books, which try to communicate a scientific topic to the general public, have rather explicative titles themselves. Not only non-fiction, but also in fiction this happens, as I delve in fiction myself. The Pulitzer Prize for Fiction in 2019 was won by Il Sussurro del Mondo, written by Richard Powers, a book where the plant world is central. A book which had international success, indeed. If we wanted to find a starting point for this discussion today, we could see it in an article that was published in 2006 on Trend in Plant Science, which was co-signed by Stefano Mancuso, an article where plant neurobiology was defined as a discipline, where intelligence and plant behavior was mentioned, and it was an article which indeed caused a lot of discourse, so to say. Of course, it was a rather provocative article as well, and this new discipline started, let's say, from this. Of course, the debate is ongoing, and the topic is still very hot. I reckon we can define this topic under several plans or tiers. The first one would be a scientific one, considering we talk about science, and we're doing at Bergamo Scienza here today, there's research and pieces of research on plant intelligence need to be seen as something that puts to the test the very scientific method we all know. At times we talk about the or the possibility of replicating the experiments that are done, which is a really critical view on the topic. At times we talk about results that cannot be reproduced or replicated, and overall a general overarching discourse on international research. Tier 2 of the discussion might be an identitarian or philosophic tier. How do we define plants today? How do we relate with them? Where do we place them within the Earth scenario? At times we talk about juridical state of plants. Should we get there? Should we stop before we get there? These are one of the topics, some of the topics that we really talk about and have a social and political impact, considering we live in an ecological crisis era. Last but not least, which is the conceptual / terminological tier. This topic really moves a lot of questions on the words that we use to depict the world and to depict plants. What are they? Who are they for us? At times, these studies talk about intelligence, behavior, soul, memory. These are all words we can use to define the plant world, and that is my question. Also, the personification or anthropomorphization, i.e. we look at plants with a human point of view. The risk is interpreting what they do, how they live, and what they are from a human point of view, i.e. projecting on plants what we are, what we do, what we feel. Is this correct? Well, this is something that should be delved into and understood. So, after this brief introduction, where I hope I have identified some of the main points, I shall ask our hosts to begin their dialogue, commenting on the title of this conference, Plants, Intelligence or Underrated? So this is a way we could try and position ourselves within this discourse, and I shall leave the floor to Paola if you want to start. Well, thank you for being here. It's really fascinating to see this room full of people. Thank you, Danilo, because you have really placed the whole list of points that will join me and Paco in the discussion, and we have already talked about this. So it's true, these two adjectives, intelligent or misunderstood, which are in the title, really sum up the hot topics of the debate. As Danilo said, there are researchers, writers, popularizers, and journalists that over the past few years have been talking with enthusiasm on plant intelligence. They talk about vegetal plant neurobiology as a science, and this has been done over the past 10 years, talking about forests as a continuum where sentiments are present, such as solidarity, on the one hand, and on the other hand we see researchers, more traditional ones, operating in labs, where they think that the usage of the word neurobiology as a metaphor is rather mistaken, as plants themselves show no nervous system, no brain, and so how could one use the term neurobiology? So, where do I place myself as a person who studies and has been studying plants in labs for over 50 years? Well, independently from the definition of intelligence, which is a rather complex problem to unpick, and maybe we should talk about this later, what I like to position myself on is the fact that we need to know that plants are alive as organisms. They are subjects which started to tread the world 450 million years ago. Homo sapiens appeared not only no longer than 200 million years ago. It's nothing but a fluttering vis-a-vis the story of the world. If we look at plants, we need to be aware that thanks to the photosynthesis they can do, they have changed the Earth's atmosphere, and they give us oxygen, which is the base of life for aerobic organisms. They do produce sugar, which is at the base of the food chain, and through agriculture, humans, 10,000 years ago, they again invented agriculture to better exploit all of this. We are in a moment of ecological transition, as Danilo mentioned before, but the whole of our culture is rooted on fossil fuels, which come from plants. So plants stand well above us, and when I think about today's policies, I think that we should look at plants rather than objects of politics in terms of subjects of policies. So saying plants are intelligence is a false problem. It's something we cannot demonstrate scientifically. So can we demonstrate that the non-intelligence of plants can be demonstrated, and we'll have a philosopher who will be able to tell me how I am mistaken? Circling back to the two adjectives that introduce and sum up this debate, I reckon that intelligent plants is a false problem in itself. At the moment, it's not easy to demonstrate their intelligence, And misunderstood, well, I have no doubt. Plant research is doing its utmost to better understand them, on the one hand, to better preserve them in their complexity and in their diversity vis-à-vis us, i.e. looking at plants as intelligent individuals having a soul or sentiments, looking them through our human lens is not the way to go. I think they are at a higher level than us. So making them less misunderstood is the goal of the international research on plant biology.
Allora, buongiorno a tutti, o buon pomeriggio, no? Mi hanno detto di parlare piano e in inglese. Allora, thank you so much, okay? Thank you so much, very slowly. No, now seriously, thanks for the invitation to the organizers. Thank you for sharing the stage today, and thank you all for being here. It's an amazing place. Actually, Bergamo, I had never been here before. Yesterday I went for un girino sulla città alta, bellissimo, e poi piacere to be able to be here with you discussing plant intelligence, right? Actually, it's real nice to see that there is such a big interest in science, and in particular today in plant science. I envy this. I'm not sure if we did an event like this in my city, in the south of Spain, whether we had such a nice, big crowd here, gathering on a Sunday morning. So thank you so much for coming today and have a chat with us. Now, as to the title of the talk, or of the gathering, the conversation, I'm not really sure whether le piante sono incomprese. Io sono incompreso. No, I mean it. So if there is someone who is not being understood, it's me. I don't know if plants are being misunderstood or not, okay? But we do have a problem. Scientists, I mean, right? I said scientist. We can talk about that because he introduced me as a philosopher of science, which is what I am. But I do experimental empirical research, and there is a lot to be said about why we do research on plant intelligence, empirical experimental research, coming from the background that I come from. So that maybe that's something you want to discuss later. But one thing is for sure. I mean, even in Danilo's introduction, he mentioned that we time-lapse to study plants' intelligent behavior. So if I may, this is a tiny tweak to the introduction. We are not time-lapsing plants to study their intelligent behavior. We are studying plants to study their behavior. And we may end up concluding, depending on the type of behavior that we examine, that behavior deserved the label intelligent. So you might have very stupid behaviors, and you might have very intelligent behaviors. And we don't know whether they exhibit one type of behavior or the other. So, you see what I mean? So we are being very cautious indeed as to what it is that we want to claim and which way we want to claim it. This is science, okay? It's true that language matters, but there is only one type of science, good science. End of the story. So the only way to do science is do good science, to have robust evidence, to have replications by independent labs, to follow the ABC of the experimental method, right? The scientific method. So with that being said, which is a way of saying, however obvious it should be to all of us, we are all on the same page. We are all agreeing with each other. These are the rules of the game, and this is the game we want to play, right? Now, for the disagreement on picking just on one, we've been going through this alla colazione all'hotel, ieri sera anche, allora io sapevo that she meant to say that, right? And she knows what I think, okay? But, first, let me say something on what we mean by intelligence, okay? Isn't it a good starting point? What do you mean by intelligence? One minor comment. Intelligence, we won't see it, neither in plants nor in animals. You cannot study animal intelligence. So you cannot complain. You cannot complain that plant intelligence is a failed research agenda or is a failed research project. Because by the same token, animal intelligence is a failed research project. If it is, which I don't think it is. I think they are not failed research projects. I think they deserve to be studied. Now we need to understand how to study them. Because if I am not able to see intelligence, I cannot crack open your skull and find intelligence sitting there. I can see your behavior. Now, plants, of course, are very slow. I need to time-lapse them. I need to speed them up. But speeding them up through time-lapse doesn't mean that I'm anthropomorphizing them. It means that I need to make the scale, the temporal scale in which their behavior unfolds, converge with the temporal scale in which I can make my observations. It's just the fact of the matter. That's the only way I can appreciate their behavior. Okay? So one thing is sophisticated or complex behavior, and I'll say something about that. And a different thing is consciousness or sentience. And by the same token, we can't discuss one thing and not the other. So you might have one animal species, which is very smart and yet not sentient. Or a plant species, which might be very smart and not sentient. Or you might have both, very smart and sentient. But one doesn't logically follow from the other. We need to do the empirical research. Think how you do the empirical research to unearth, to understand animal sentience. What do you do with an animal? I want to find out if a frog is sentient, if a honeybee is sentient, if a dog is sentient, if an ant, a termite, a dolphin is sentient. You name it, whatever. You choose the species. But I cannot ask them, and they cannot report back verbally like humans. I can only infer it. So what scientists, animal scientists, use to find out whether animals are sentient or not is markers of sentience, indicators of sentience. So they can say, okay, do they respond to aversive stimuli, noxious stimuli, running away from the source of stimulation? Do they lose sensitivity when exposed to anesthetics? Can you anesthetize them and then they respond differently? Can they perform sophisticated forms of learning, such as condition learning? They ask many different questions, and they try to find an indirect way to know whether they are sentient or not. Now, all we can do is to follow the same rules of the game and say, okay, I'm going to time-lapse plants, I'm going to observe their behavior, and if it is sufficiently complex, which means it's not just an adaptation, I don't care about mere adaptations. They're great. I love them. I mean, I love polar bears to have white fur. But polar bears are not smart because they have white fur. They simply are able to pass down their genes because they can camouflage. So I'm not complaining about adaptive behavior. Adaptive behavior is great. We exhibit many adaptive behaviors. But on top of being adaptive, behavior has got to be sufficiently flexible, so it's not just a pre-programmed response, hardwired. It's got to be flexible enough to deal with uncertainty. It's got to be anticipatory. It's got to be goal-directed. And then when you have a combination of all these factors, if you do, I agree, if you do, that's why I'm working in this field, because I want to find out, then you might have a good indirect reason to infer that these organisms are intelligent or sentient. See what I mean? There are many more points you raised, but I guess I should shut up.
Credo che Paola volesse...
Sì. Sì, Paco ha dato già subito.
Yes, Paco has already given a really precise idea of his idea of intelligence, considered as a complex expression of a behavior which can be more or less complicated or flexible, which is different to genetically defined behavior. On my end, I would like to start from scratch and understand the meaning of intelligence as a word as we use it on a daily basis. I shall premise by citing Piero Bianucci, which us in Torino know really well. He's an amazing popularizer. He wrote Creativi si nasce si diventa, where he listed a plethora of intelligence methods, that of rationality, that which is mathematic and so on. But in actual fact, I would like to start with a reductionist definition of intelligence, the one that most is attained to a biologist, i.e. individuals are intelligent when they can adapt, as Paco has anticipated, to the external environment, i.e. they develop strategies that allow them to have the highest individual or collective goal or fitness. If we look at this with a clinical biologist eye, this means everything circles back to the characteristic of a living cell, independently from its complexity. Let's look at a bacteria, a prokaryote. Is there a higher organism in terms of intelligence than a bacteria? Well, bacteria are really potent. They can understand through receptors on their external membrane all the environment variations. Following this, they can activate or deactivate several mechanisms so as to create biofilms that make them indestructible. Think about those enamel layers on our teeth. This is true for bacteria, for dolphins, for trees. Everything is related to us, and it is the very definition of the ability of adapting and responding, which is peculiar to the concept of living cell. If we look at this adaptability definition, every living cell is intelligent, otherwise it wouldn't be living. We are interested in another layer, in another tier, whereby we know intelligence is associated to a series of cognitive activities which are ever more complex, i.e. the possibility of discussing in such a way that I am doing right now, or convincing with more or less success by explaining our thoughts, the possibility of forecasting, the possibility of developing abstract thoughts, and last but not least, one's own awareness, which is rather complex as a thing itself. So I always quote a definition of intelligence I have only recently read from a musician, which I don't know, Quirico Principe, which states intelligence is the product of the mind. I really liked this definition because it's made up of abstract concepts, just like the very concepts we do use when defining intelligence are, i.e. the possibility of judging, forecasting, one's own awareness, one's awareness of themselves. That all operates in the abstract realm. So it's not that we match mind, brain, and nervous system. And that is one topic for neurobiology, which I'm not an expert in. But that, at times, doesn't directly imply the need for an organ which needs to be matched with intelligence in such a precise fashion. Rather, if I think that intelligence is the delivery of the mind, well, do plants have a mind as an organ? Well, no. And that brings me back to the starting point. It's something which we cannot scientifically demonstrate. At the moment, we cannot look at this cognitive capacity due to them having a mind, because that is abstract. So I'm well aware that the definition of intelligence is crucial to this discourse. I'm not sure how many of us are in this room, and I'm sure that each and every one of us has a different definition of intelligence.
Sì, ci siamo d'accordo e non ci siamo
Io
d'accordo.
d'accordo.
Tutti e due allo stesso tempo, vero? Vediamo, I suggest we move beyond terminological disputes, because otherwise we could be for 2 hours talking about terms and the meaning of them. I'm just going to give you one example. The editor-in-chief of a very famous journal, I won't say the name because this is being recorded, said once, when he was asked, what is cognition? The editor-in-chief of a very important journal on cognition. And he said, cognition is what I want it to be. He was joking, but he wasn't joking. So if we go to the social aspects beyond, at the backstage of how science is being done, we can get lost in all the miseries of human existence. Because scientists are human beings, the same as the plumber or the carpenter or the bartender. We forget that we are human beings. Scientists are human beings, with their good things or their bad things. So they also have hormones, if you see what I mean. Just going to give you another example to see the weight of labels, how dangerous is to rely too heavily on words. Plants have serotonin, dopamine, melatonin, glutamate, GABA. Of course, plant biologists know that, obviously. But they don't treat these molecules as per their signaling role. They call them biomediators. They don't want to call them neurotransmitters. The same molecule, okay? GABA, take GABA, or glutamate. You know what is their answer? When you say, hey, I'm not saying that this is the same molecule because we know. I'm saying that it is playing a signaling role. And when I say that that signaling role deserves to be appreciated as the functional role that a neurotransmitter plays, when neurotransmitters play that role in animals, you know what the response is? In print. They say, now I can say this because it's in print, they have published this. They say, no, plants, molecules are not neurotransmitters, so the same molecule, despite acknowledging the signaling role they play, because, and they go to the dictionary, to the definition, because they don't have synapses. And because neurotransmitters make sense as you are synapsing in between neurons, then voila, same molecule, same signaling role. I'm sorry, the dictionary doesn't let you use the term. Now, isn't it wiser to be more open-minded and revise our semantics, revise our definitions as we make progress? I'm going to give you another example. Melatonin. Melatonin was discovered in cattle, in the bovine cattle in the 50s, 60s. Now, we know it's secreted by the pineal gland, okay? It's an animal thing. Oh, we have melatonin. You cross the pond, you fly to Nuova York. Sono un po' di mal di testa, il jet lag, 8 ore all'aereo. E poi you go to the chemist and buy a melatonin tablet, okay? Synthetic melatonin, because you know it allows you, it eases for you to go back to your day-night cycle, because you are out of sync. You flew from Milano, and now in Nueva York you are out of sync. You need a few days to adjust your internal clocks, right? Of course, plants have the same internal clocks, circadian clocks. So all nature ticks to the planetary regularities. Day-night cycles, temperature up and down, light on and off. So all these cyclic regularities are very informative to any form of life whatsoever, right? Any form of life whatsoever. So we take legumes, okay? Legumes. From a physiological perspective, we know legumes, now I'm going to speak metaphorically, they go to bed, okay? They fold their leaves at night. In fact, they do it anticipatorily, right? They do it ahead of time. Just before the lights go off, the sun sets, they anticipatorily fold them. In the morning, they unfold them just prior to sunrise. And we know the mechanisms From the molecular and the cellular biology and from the plant physiology, we know the mechanisms. It's governed by the same oscillators, their circadian clocks, right? When we see the peak of melatonin, it just takes place right before falling the leaves at night. And then during the day, it wears off. So it wears off. The same way, the same dynamics of melatonin concentration in animals. Now, you know what? Plant melatonin, the same molecule was discovered in 1995. You know why it took 3 decades? Because they weren't expected to have melatonin. That was an animal thing. But the funny thing is that it took 9 more years until 2004 to agree upon a label, the scientific community. And then, at last, in 2004, purtroppo sai cosa hanno fatto? Hanno messo il prefisso fito. Perché melatonin è la mia melatonina. Plant melatonin, it's phytomelatonin. So they had to add the prefix, right? So let me, I'm sorry if it's, let me just tell you I don't know if you can, because I don't know the subtitle in Italian. They have translated Planta Sapiens with the following subtitle in Italian. Perché il mondo vegetale ci assomiglia più di quanto crediamo. Ok? Sai perché? Sai il rischio, where is the risk of doing that? When I say Planta Sapiens, and I insist that I'm not speaking metaphorically, that I'm talking about the sentience, the sapiens, the intelligence of plants, in the very same way that you speak of the sentience, the intelligence of animals, if you go to the subtitle, perché ci assomigliano più a noi di quanto crediamo, the mistake is to think that we want to make them similar to us. And I agree that they have their own problems. They have their own problems, and they come up with their own solutions. We don't want to make plants into mini-humans. We want to understand them for what they are, right? So the problem, again, as with having synapses in the definition of neurotransmitters, of melatonin for us, and stick the prefix phyto if you want to talk about the melatonin of plants, is the very same problem, that instead of widening up the problem space and realizing that nature has come across many different solutions that converge in something being shared across the tree of life, la chiave maestra, the master key that unlocks the secret of flexible, anticipatory, goal-directed behavior. But I still miss, and I want Paola to explain, I still miss why she insists, why you are insisting that it is not scientifically possible to test it. I don't get it. Can you test can you test rat intelligence? If your answer is no, fine. But if your answer is yes, you can test scientifically for rat intelligence. Explain why you cannot test the intelligence of organisms outside the kingdom Animalia.
Paolo, se vuoi rispondere
aiuto.
subito.
Very well.
Investito dal torrente di...
I've been invested by his torrential speech. So the subtitle, Perché il mondo vegetale ci assomiglia più di quanto crediamo, why does the plant kingdom is the plant kingdom similar to us? Well, I would have it the other way around, because we have something in common with plants. As I was saying, plants are rather more ancient than us. They have developed an evolutionary path well before us, which is completely different than ours. Their history is spread about at the very basis. And so, circling back to semantics, and I don't really want to really stress this, well, at the moment, it's not scientifically proved or provable. Yes, as plants, the eukaryotic cell of the plant is similar to that of the animal, differently from the plastidian, which can do photosynthesis. Well, it's obvious that several metabolism practices stand in common, and a series of neurotransmitters are produced by some vegetable cells. At the very moment, we have no clear idea of what they really do. In my opinion, experiments could be done, though, because one could think that by genome editing, one could produce plants by selecting the deletion of some peculiar mechanisms that create melatonin, and that allows us to prove that behavior we associate with intelligence, whether it's different or not. Well, I reckon that these approaches at the moment in researchers that focus on plant intelligence are not used. And so I do see a sort of separation between research which is done by properly thinking about how we could better use different plants for our health or for nutrition and so on and so forth, whether we use sophisticated technologies, vis-a-vis another hand where this question, which requires a more holistic vision, and experiments which do not yield immediate results or an immediate answer. So, I'm not saying the problem is not there. The problem is there. It's really interesting. Otherwise, we wouldn't be here. But I do wonder whether there are other more moving questions. And following that, I wonder why are people so invested in wondering whether plants are intelligent? On this, I do not have an answer. And Paco's answer, which is saying, well, yes, as we do wonder why the animal behavior is as it is, we do wonder whether the plant kingdom has such similar reasoning behind. As a plant researcher, I have other questions if I think about their interaction with other organisms and situations, questions which are unanswered. Plants obviously interact with fungi, bacteria, viruses, and humans, and so these are the questions that move me inside. I wonder, is that an intelligent behavior or not? Well, that is a thing. One thing is your interest, one thing is other people's, of course, just like yours. And as you can see, they could just go on and on. That is a demonstration of the fact that it's a really kindling debate, one could say. And the discussion is rather complex. It touches on many, many points, such as intelligence just being the first one, which is always there. And then you touched on other topics. Well, I would like you to circle back to the scientific topic you have mentioned just about now, chiefly the experimental side, because it's where more or most of the critics stand when it comes to plant intelligence, i.e. the non-reproducibility or non-replicability of such experiments. And I would like you to delve in onto that from your own point of view. Also, possibly to give better understanding to the public who is following us. We should try to frame this discourse within the boundaries of the international research, because just talking about this right now, this could seem like a central or really centric discourse. But how can we really place it? I'm not sure who wants to start. I could talk about reproducibility or replicability, and you can do the other one, if you want.
You see what I mean, why I want to talk about replicability? To understand how seriously I take it. I take the issue of the lack of replication. I have spent the last 3 years of my time, 3 years, trying to replicate an experiment that was published in 2016, allegedly demonstrating the existence of associative learning in plants. You know, associative learning. For those of you not familiar, think of Pavlov's dog. Okay, you have a dog, you ring the bell, food. If you ring the bell, the dog doesn't know what that means. But if you pair the bell with the food, bell, food, bell, food, bell, food, in the end the dog knows that the bell means food, and then it will salivate right after the bell rings. Okay? It's associative learning. It's learning to associate those two stimuli, okay? Now, this is a good example, actually, of the way to proceed, of how we should proceed. Let's talk science, okay? So, what we are doing here is simply, and this is the best way to show that you can do empirical research on plant intelligence, in this case, learning, a cognitive capacity, the capacity to learn, okay? You can simply customize your protocols. You've got to customize the protocols that we are bringing from the animal literature. You have to. Why? Because plants behave differently. They don't locomote. They stay seated and they grow. Their time scale is so different from ours. So you need to, for example, decide the interstimul interval. So the interval, the temporal interval in between the presentation of the bell ringing and the food. So all those things have got to be customized to be presented to the plant, because the plant is not the dog. The plant is not the dog, but associative learning can be scientifically tested in any organism whatsoever if you customize the protocols. A different issue is whether you find it or not. So testing hypothesis means that you don't know what the result is going to be. When I'm testing a scientific hypothesis, if I knew the result, I wouldn't do it. I do it because I don't know. So mistake number one is for people, the skeptics, to think that we want to demonstrate plant learning. I don't want to demonstrate plant learning. I want to find out if plants learn. If they do, great. If they don't, great. Because either way, we have learned. That is what science is about, right? They may not need to learn the way Pavlov's dog does. That's a different issue. We may have different motivations, different interests, as Paola said. That's a different issue. We all have different interests. And a different question is the rationale, the logical steps that you follow when you are customizing a protocol and applying the scientific method. So you cannot say that that cannot be research on plants. You can say that your guess is that it will deliver falsification, refutatory, so it won't be confirmed. Well, yeah, great. That's what I want to find out. That's why I'm doing the experiments. But I cannot discuss plant learning like this. I think they learn. I think, no, I need to do the experiments. That's what I've been doing for the last 3 years, trying to replicate this study from 2016 that reported confirmation of the working hypothesis that plants learn by association. You know what I found in 3 years? A lot of problems, and nothing but problems. The design, the experimental design I'm trying to replicate is completely flawed. It has all sorts of problems. They are not even seeing how the pea plant grows in this case, because they use an opaque maze. So it's opaque, you cannot see through. So there are many, many problems, and we couldn't go through the problems. It's more interesting to understand my approach, because you might say, Paco, and why do you spend all this time trying to replicate that study? Because I want to find out. Because science has got to be moved by curiosity. And that means curiosity has got to be free from prejudices. And a prejudice is to say that only plants can possibly learn. No, any organism could learn. It's an empirical question. Let's find out. So even if plants, now we are finishing a pre-registered study. So we are doing a pre-registered study. For those not familiar, that means that we submit the paper to the journal as if we had run the experiments. So everything but the actual data. If the journal approves the publication, then you run the experiments. And they commit themselves to publishing it regardless of whether it's a positive or a negative result. This way, you avoid a confirmation bias, because journals usually publish positive results. Right? So do we understand the difference between having the suspicion, having a good reasons to doubt? So doubt is good. So skepticism has got to be there. We've got to be a skeptic. I don't know if they learn, but I cannot possibly claim that it cannot be researched. It can be researched with the same tools that any other organism can be studied. Behavior. I'm not talking about the study of their cells. I'm talking about studying the behavior of the organism as such. And that can certainly be tested and tested. So it's got to be, otherwise it wouldn't be an empirical hypothesis.
Okay.
This is science.
Allora, grazie, sarò velocissima.
I'll be really quick. I'll just say a couple of things about Danilo's question. So try and Google in Italian le piante e l'intelligenza, or plant and intelligence, intelligent plants. You will see many a book with huge sales, which have been mentioned by Danilo before, which overarch a plethora of topics. If you look at the names or titles, at times they're written by researchers such as Paco's, but fundamentally they are written by journalists, writers, with a scientific aspect is not as strong. Try and do the same research in English, i.e. Are Plants Intelligence, or articles on plants intelligence, and so on and so forth. You won't see as many books or works. And this goes back to Danilo's question. Actually, the more traditional, let's say, with preconceptions, scientific world possibly is not as interested in this question. And if someone looks at works published on scientific publishings, well, you can only count a few. Besides that of 2006 on the proposal of neurobiology, well, other works published on local publishings, which are one of that, Professor Balusca, for example, which has his own journal. Well, those pieces of work have to do with plant intelligence, and they are sort of niche pieces of works. So this, just to tell you that a couple of days ago, at the beginning of the week, a piece of work was published on Trends in Plant Science, this popularizing but really serious journal, where a well-furnished group of researchers from all over the world place themselves against the idea of anthropomorphizing forests or woods by citing two books that are detrimental. That is, on the one hand, that of Simar, La Pianta Madre, Mother Plant, and the other one of the German writer Wolbert, which we cited already on forests and what forests know. One of the comments, besides the scientific comments, which are not different than what I have tried to tell you, pose an interesting point. So if this concept becomes so overpowering, and I'm really sensitive to this, in a moment where there are EU regulations such as the Green Deal or other regulations and directives which nationally one implements and are aligned at a national, local level differently from Milan and Turin on how to manage plants and green areas in cities, those policymakers, what sort of importance give to plant intelligence or to other boring results stemming from research? Which of the two sides do they give more weight? And the debate is really interesting, although I reckon more hard research is doing something detrimental in such a way that they don't, without any prejudice, focus themselves on what Paco mentioned, because it will come a time where policy making, just think about green transition or planting trees in cities or reforestation, planting thousands of trees in the cities to save them. Well, all of these are really important problems, and having clear ideas on why is easier to mediate the idea of plants having a soul, having sentiments, vis-à-vis how they behave and what is their evolutionary history. Well, these two differences are not...
I think we agree with each other. And paradoxically, I agree so much with you that, and I understand that there is such a big risk that bad science and pseudoscience get so much media coverage that I don't understand why we want to waste an hour and a half to talk about bad science. Let's talk about the good science. So we are giving coverage to the bad science. So if you know some people are doing things that are wrong, don't talk about them. Talk about the things that are being done correctly, and then we get coverage of the good stuff. When I speak here in Planta Sapiens, when I say that that sapiens is not metaphorical, you'll find that I'm not citing any of those books that you mentioned in my book. Those simply are not cited. I don't talk about the bad stuff to say it's bad. I only cite the things I consider are good science. So I suggest that we try to make an effort to speak of plant intelligence scientifically. That's what I've tried to do, speaking of how to customize protocols from the animal literature. And I insist, those protocols can be done. A different issue is the result. Now, sentience. I study plant sentience. On top of doing time-lapse, I do plant electrophysiology, okay? I insert electrodes, I use an amplifier, and I can check the internal activity. Now, you have two windows, okay? The window of the overt behavior of the plant through time-lapse, and the window of the inner electrical doings through the electrophysiological recordings that I can see on the screen. Does that mean that you are using those recordings as an EEG recording a human patient? No. No, no, no. So let's not talk about the secret life of plants, okay? That's pseudoscience. Let's talk about science. And what does science say? Science, cognitive neuroscience, can use electrophysiological recordings in animal subjects and perform a time series analysis. So it can analyze data as it flows through time, okay? Those recordings. And then can measure certain metrics of complexity, of entropy. So these are metrics, measurements that cognitive neuroscientists perform on a regular basis to throw light upon the inner doings of animals, okay? Now, I mentioned at the beginning that we can study scientifically sentience in animals indirectly through indicators, markers. One marker of consciousness in the animal literature is a certain degree of complexity. There are many measurements. There are a couple that people use mostly, right? Complexity metrics and entropy metrics. Those two types of metrics are being used when plotted with this data, time series analysis of animal data, okay? They can be used, both electrophysiological time series and behavioral time series. So you can see what the subject is doing from the inside and from the outside. And you can use those measurements to infer they are being used customarily, published in Nature, in Science, and many other journals to throw light upon those correlates of subjective experience. Does that mean that when those metrics are applied to plants, by default, you already have a scientific justification of the existence of plant sentience? No. No. Does that mean that we cannot use the same tools? No. Of course we can use the same tools. We should. The only point I'm making is that it is legitimate to use the same methodological toolkit, regardless of the outcome. Because we are looking at behavior and we are looking at inner activity. And that happens in any form of life whatsoever, regardless of the outcome. So let's talk about how to do science correctly.
Sì. Bene. Io spero che siamo riusciti in questi
Very well, I hope that over these 45 minutes we've given you a tasting of the debate on this topic. I hope we've given you a panoramic on research and where intelligence of plants stands. I reckon we could move on to the Q&A session, possibly. I see some raised hands. Yes, it is needed. And a round of applause if you want. I think microphones will be given. There are questions here in the front rows.
Grazie.
Thank you. Thank you for this really interesting session, for the speakers. I'm not a scientist, and I don't even have a university degree, but I have been taught that intelligence only belonged to mankind. And intelligence was always matched with consciousness. But I do understand that intelligence in mankind is present also in unconscious organs. So we have conscious and unconscious intelligence. The same thing could be said for animals. We have intelligent animals that is really clear and it needs no examples. But plants are intelligent in their own way, i.e. they create spikes to defend themselves, or they grow up in height so as not to have animals eat their fruits. They catch insects in such ways to nourish themselves. And so in that way, they are intelligent. But I also want to move beyond this. Intelligence exists in everything that has been created, because, for example, water are being made up by oxygen and hydrogen as they fuse together. That bears some degree of intelligence. And I reckon intelligence is present in every aspect. If not, how could evolution be explained? Evolution in terms of how we live today, where we got today. And that is my point. Just a quick note. As I try to say, if we use the idea of intelligence that you have just now expressed, every living cell bears intelligence. Why? Because that is the basis of what is living. Every cell has a membrane with receptors that allow the very cell to perceive what happens around them. As a consequence, they react with their metabolism. So if we take this basic definition, which is biologic, which is reductionist, everything is intelligence. It's not that plants are more or less intelligent than us, or than bacteria or an amoeba. We all have this form of intelligence, which is reaction to the outer environment. But that is the very nature of what is living, and I hope we all agree on this. If I can, just one word, he said
that I understood from your last comment about physics, l'acqua, la molecula l'acqua, and there is a risk of panpsychism. By defending that intelligence is all over the place, we might be risking deflating the very idea of intelligence. Because inner matter, non-organic matter, at least I don't believe, and I assume I can speak on behalf of Paola as well, we are not into that. We are into biological intelligence. So we run the risk of making the term far too wide and meaningless. It wouldn't be a working term anymore. Now, with that being said, it's funny, even in logos, even in science festivals, people are even more eager to accept the idea of artificial intelligence, non-biological artificial intelligence. ChatGPT, blah, 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 blah. Many people are even convinced that some form of artificial intelligence is round the corner, maybe in a few years' time. That's respectfully nonsense, according to me. So this is biology. This is a property that emerges out of living matter. To me, it's interesting to understand why some people believe that ChatGPT is smart. Because you are able to entertain a conversation with the gadget. So we use ourselves, humans, Homo sapiens, as the gold standard. And then we say, hey, if you're intelligent, it's insofar as you relate to me. Let's forget about Homo sapiens. Let's forget about ourselves. If we forgot about ourselves, who could understand ChatGPT as intelligent? It's nothing. There is nothing there. So we are making it up in our minds.
Okay. C'era il signore.
Buongiorno.
Prego.
Okay, with a friend, I had a chat,
Alla quale poi arrivo.
which I'm going to get to. The first living being on Earth, be it casually or not, is the prokaryote, if I'm not mistaken, which originated all the living forms. In the last decades, we have learned the importance of the microbiota, which is in us, and we also understood that it's the brain, or the first brain, how it is called, is there. So if within the microbiota we have prokaryotes which have created the very brain, I reckon that the idea is that necessarily there is a need for a form of intelligence. I reckon science is limited by the evolutionary path, which is fundamentally bound to chance. And I reckon that is the very index of these situations. So the microbiota is a first brain, and I reckon possibly we need to make a distinction and understand, in my opinion, that the idea is every adaptation, be it for white bears, why are they white, and so on and so forth, in terms of evolution, it's normal that they make part of the evolutionary process, an adaptation one. But, as Leonard said, talking about plants, had demonstrated, and he had classified them in terms of intelligence, how they place their leaves. Well, that in itself is rather intelligent. And I cannot circle back to randomness when it comes to that. Is that a form of evolution? Well, in my opinion, that appears as a patent form of intelligence, undoubtedly. So, starting from the very beginning, why is the prokaryote not deemed intelligent? What is the limitation? Philosophy, in my opinion, maintains that prokaryotes are intelligent, whereas science doesn't. Well, possibly I didn't really explain myself. I started by saying that bacteria, E. coli, are one of the most intelligent organisms in the world if we use the biological definition, which is tied to living things. Just try and think about every strategy from microorganisms. And as an expert of microbiotes in plants, I reckon that you, if I may, you fell into the incorrect usage of metaphors. When we talk about microbiome, we talk about that as the second human genome or second plant genome. When we talk about human microbiota, which we have recently learned bunches on, not just the taxonomical definition of bacteria, we talk about what is the gut-brain axis, something you tangentially mentioned, i.e. this connection where bacteria within our guts bear effects on our brain and on our behavior. And so the gut-brain axis term doesn't imply intelligence for the microbiota, but rather a series of fundamental functions that control digestive processes in our organism, as well as development processes, but fundamentally immunity processes. So this explains this axis concept. What is marvelous is that within plants, we've seen that plant microbiota, albeit being different in terms of microbial communities vis-à-vis the human one, plays the very same functions, i.e. it influences the development of the plant, how they can improve their mineral nutrition, and I am really prepared on this because it is the very essence of my job, and also it improves the immunity of plants. So that is paramount in terms of importance, but in such a way, we're not talking or referring to the intelligence of the microbiota, as it has an internal process of self-regulation and self-constituting processes which are rather complex. And I'm not sure if I have explained it myself. Yes, you have. But the problem is tied to the prokaryote itself, so the intelligence of that, which necessarily needs to be recognized. Yes, the bacteria, the prokaryote. So it's a bunch of chemicals, but it's what created life, ultimately, the very nucleus from where everything stemmed from. Are there other questions? I don't know if from the streaming we have some. Possibly not.
I wanted to say something on top of what, I entirely agree with Paola. I mean, clearly that's the case. I mean, the brain and gut axis and everything, and we all know that, and it's really cool, by the way. It's real nice. But why it's nice as well from a cognitive science perspective, okay? From a higher level cognitive science perspective, not just from the level of the mechanism involved, it's really interesting because this is a great example of how we humans are, after all, way more decentralized than we thought we were. So usually we say plants, because they are sessile, because they are rooted, they can't flee, they can't run away, you know, they have to deploy, they have evolved a divide and conquer strategy, okay? If I cannot escape, well, I'll just, you know, if you chop one branch off, I will grow another branch. There is nothing essential hidden anywhere. So it's divide and conquer, okay? Animals, we think we are way more centralized. Central nervous system, our mammalian neocortex, and we have this idea of ourselves. And these examples are really good to emphasize that even we centralized animal body systems are way more decentralized, and things are happening at many different scales beyond the neural hardware. So intelligence doesn't sit in the brain. It's an emergent phenomena that has to do with many neural and non-neural aspects. Bodily aspects, microbiota, human and non-human genomes. So it's the collectivity of it all. So maybe we are more similar to plants than we thought we were. That's what I mean to say.
Io lo richiedo, se c'è qualche altra domanda, insomma, alzate la mano.
If there are other questions, just raise your hand. Yes, one at the back. And we still have time for at least one other question. There is a question online. Maybe we can do this first. Yes, can we read it? Yes. Rather interesting one. Fungi that create mycorrhizae with plants, can they have a role in communication and intelligence? Oh, it was projected already and I didn't see it. So, Paola, maybe? May I? Yes. Just a couple of words to explain that 90% of plants have their roots associated or matched to symbiote fungi, mycorrhizal fungi, which belong to the plant microbiota we mentioned before. So we know that all those functions that plant microbiota does are identifiable in the functions of these fungi, which are associated to higher plants in height and more domestic ones, one could say. So what happens? The question refers to one of those popular concepts, rather famous ones, I reckon, which have been mentioned lately, which tend to describe forests as connected in the single essence of a single individual, thanks to the network of the mycorrhizal fungi that connect the different plants at a root level. This idea was discussed a lot. And so the idea of the forest as connected in a sort of wood wide web, which, as an idea, was pushed by a Canadian researcher, Suzanne Simard, who wrote La Pianta Madre as a book, The Mother Plant, which was rather criticized. What does she say? Well, that within a forest we have a mother plant, which thanks to the network that the mycorrhizal fungi develop, well, they can send nutrients to all the little buds of the seeds that she has produced. An idea comes to mind, which often is really moving to people, that is that of a family within the forest, with a mother plant, with some sort of sense of protection towards her buds. Well, where does this come from? From a rather serious piece of research she did at the end of the 90s, where she was doing her PhD in Canada, and where she proved that whether a birch was to be studied when it was in the light and when a geosperm in the shadow was studied by giving some sort of marked carbon to the birch, she found the same component in the other plant grown in the shadow. So things were connected or exchanged. And that was hypothesized to be due to the action of the mycorrhizal fungi, which had a clever gap-bridging function. This result, rather serious, rather solid, has been confirmed over and over. All the branching theories from this, i.e. that of a hub presentiated by bigger plants, which are mother plants. Well, all of those theories have not been experimentally proved. So, critics, and there has been interesting pieces of works, i.e. one published on Nature and Evolution at the beginning of the year, prove that these pieces of data have no scientific support. They are fascinating, people are really drawn to them, but there is no scientific basis. So to answer to that question, we cannot say that these fungi play an intelligent gap-bridging role by connecting plants. I'm sure we know that in a rather more strict sense, there is a connection, and we've seen it in particular conditions, but it's not correct to extend it to the whole of the forest at the beginning or at the moment. So I reckon that is the more scientific answer. And this is telling on how important it is to find the good words or the correct ones so as to divulge the scientific results, so as not to create other paths or ways. The article wraps up with a sentence, i.e. we should try to avoid from transforming what is lying beneath us into a fantasy world that doesn't mirror reality and what we know about this reality. I reckon we have time for the last questions at the very back, and then we should be done with. I wanted to ask if and how your research, whether plants are intelligent or not, could help over the past 10 years astrobiology, which is a newly formed branch of science when it comes to understanding whether possible extraterrestrial life is intelligence and how that could happen. Thank you.
That's a very good question. Definitely, there is a lot that we can do. And you know what? Because after all, you are right. If we are thinking of how we train our eye and our mind to appreciate, to study the intelligence surrounding us, that we might be missing it because we don't have the right type of mental gear. We are not trained to see it, and we are perceiving it. We are misperceiving it. That happens very often. That could be a good way to train yourself for the study of, for example, some record of extraterrestrial life that you don't know of. Let's put that together with the other question on prokaryotes. You know that prokaryote that might be a bridge to astrobiology, okay? You know why those cells without even a nucleus, prokaryotes, are intelligent? Because they are able to integrate information. Integrate, okay? So we have this cartoon understanding of bacteria or plants whereby we see them as simply responding like, you know, light, phototropic response, gravity, grow my roots downwards, chemical, so it's like as if they were responding to the environment on a one-to-one basis, responding to one source of stimulation, hardwire, right? That never happens simply because you never receive one source of stimulation. We are constantly stimulated by many different informational channels. Bacteria, prokaryotes, and extraterrestrial life, if it exists. Okay? So to me, the litmus test, the real key to know if you have a fossil record and want to discover whether that points towards the form of intelligence, it will have to relate to the capacity to integrate. Because in the end, any organism whatsoever needs to make up its mind. Of course, I hope you understand the square quotes. Make up its mind, be it a cell or a pluricellular organism, to provide a response that is adaptive at a global level. Not just responding to light, to chemicals, to gravity, to the whole thing. I integrate it all and provide one single response. Any system whatsoever, biological, that is able to do that, in my view, that would be the entry route to testing the specific type of intelligence it has. I have time for one minor comment? One minor comment because I think this is very important. I mean, this is a science festival. Darwin. Please, let's go back to Darwin. You know what happens with Darwin? I bring in Planta Sapiens, I bring in every single chapter, there is one tiny wink, guiño de occhio, no? A Darwin. ¿Por qué? Why? Because he was able to see to the naked eye what we are missing even as of today, 2023 time-lapsing. He saw more to the naked eye than we see through time-lapse footage. And this means that education, please, education, and training our minds and jettisoning, dropping prejudices is the only way to go. Otherwise, we will miss any form of intelligence out there, the very same way that we miss it when it's just right the corner. I shut up.
Sì. No, io vorrei solo aggiungere una cosa.
Yes, I would just add, the philosopher, where he went. Grasping his last words, as we are at a science festival, what we need is good science. Also to understand whether plants are intelligent, indeed. Very well.
Senza pregiudizi.
With no prejudice.
Parte né
on the one and on the other hand. Thank you all. Is that all? Yes, we can wrap up this session. Thanks to Bergamo Scienza for having set everything up for us. Paola Bonfante, Paco Calvo, thank you because you have come here to talk with us about this topic. And thank you to the audience who has borne with us for an hour and a half. Thank you.